All right, guys. So, unbeknownst to you, as we begin or continue rather our discussion on ethics, this PowerPoint presentation has crashed 3 different times as I've tried to begin this, or not as I've tried to begin it, but as I actually was well into the presentation. So, you'll probably start to see a knot or a big bruise come up here where I've been bashing my head into the wall because of this problem. Of course, I'm just kidding. I haven't bashed my head in the wall, but I'm not kidding about Microsoft crashing about 50 different times. All right, so we'll try to continue with this, and in case that it does crash, I've pulled up hopefully a backup system to where we can just continue on with our slides and pull them together quickly. If it does, in fact, crash, hopefully it will not. All right, so with that said, we're trying to continue with this discussion in ethics. And we're moving away from utilitarianism, which we just discussed previously in our last lecture, our last video. And now what we want to do is continue in these ethical theories that try to give us an objective or absolute sense of morality. Remember, we moved away, as we move away from moral relativism and something like ethical egoism, which, in my view, well, you can go back and look at what those are in my view. But as we move away from those, we're trying to get into an ethical theory that wants to ground true and objective morality, right? Meaning real, like it's really right or really wrong to perform X, Y, or Z. It's not just my opinion. It's not just because somebody arbitrarily decided this, whatever. There's a real objective right or wrong. Because as you recall, the majority of the philosophical community, whether they are religious or atheistic or not, they want to affirm some sort of real and objective morality. And so the major players in that game, as we've discussed, are Kant's Deontology, which we're about to discuss here. In fact, we'll go ahead and pull this first slide up. Or, something like utilitarianism, which we've discussed. And or virtue theory, some of these other particular theories that we will get into. But one of the major players here is this Kantian, Immanuel Kant, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, the Enlightenment era philosopher Kant. His version of a deontological type ethic. Now, just right off the bat, we looked at some of the difficulties with utilitarianism when you try to ground your ethical theory specifically on the axiom of whatever provides the greatest good for the greatest number of people, that just is the good thing or the right thing to act. And we looked at some of the major problems with that particular theory when you try to ground your ethical theory, your actions, your rightness or wrongness of something solely based on the consequences, right? There's these what we would intuit as just devastating results if that's what we try to use to ground our entire ethical theory. Now, Kant's deontological ethic stands here. Utilitarianism stands here as a consequentialist type ethic, utilitarianism. Kant's ethic, on this hand, is in stark contrast. These two are in great conflict with one another in the sense that Kant's deontological ethic is completely unconcerned with the consequences. The consequences have nothing to do with whether or not an action, a behavior or whatnot is right or wrong. It is completely and utterly within the specific behavior or action itself. The act itself is intrinsically right or intrinsically wrong in and of itself, nothing to do with the consequences. Right, so you may have heard it said this way and just not realize that whoever was saying this, perhaps your grandmother or your mama, was giving you something of a deontological type ethic when they said something like the following: look, you do the right thing and to heck with the consequences. You do the right thing and you let the consequences play out as they may. Because at the end of the day, you just got to know that you did the right thing. Right, well, that's a deontological type ethic. And Kant would say something in a similar vein. Now, of course, remember the consequentialists or the utilitarian type ethic would say something like, well, no. The consequences are what make it right or wrong, right? And we saw some of the difficulties with that. Now, if you've heard this, well, I'll probably wait and when we discuss something like divine command theory, which is another type of deontological type ethic. But I'll wait and put it in a religious context when we discuss that. Some of the statements you may have heard that are deontological type ethical statements. But before we get to those, we're going to need to discuss Kantian deontology, specifically how he tries to ground, allegedly grounds, real objective rights and wrongs. We're going to look at some of the appeals of that and then some of the difficulties with that. But first, let's get into it to start to describe it. So first, the overview and the purpose of this would be what? Remember, we've talked about so far that these ethical theories that we're bringing up now are prescriptive and normative ethical theories, that they try to attain to reach the objective and or absolute morality. Excuse me. Remember, in the sense that they're trying to say that there really is a true right and true wrong, right? Regardless of whatever, you may believe, whatever your religion is, whatever your cultural upbringing is. Remember, these are in stark contrast to moral relativism. These are saying there are real rights and real wrongs. You've got to remember that, because a lot of times in arguments, say theistic type arguments, people are going to try to say that it's a false dichotomy, that if there is no God, then there is no real right or wrong. And they're going to bring up, people that hold to that persuasion are going to bring up these types of theories. And so this is why you want to educate yourself in regard to these different philosophical topics as they pertain to ethical theories. Now, again, the overview and the purpose. Now, we're going to get deeper into this, but Immanuel Kant, first, is an intellectual powerhouse. I mean, his intellectual acumen and intellectual prowess is not to be overstated. And so one of the ways that he's going to try to ground his ethical theory, this rightness and wrongness, this true and objective rightness and wrongness, he's going to try to ground this in rationality, in human rationality specifically, the goodwill and duty. Remember, because deontology, that's derived from the Greek of duty or obligation. That's just what this deontological word, or this deontology, the word rather, this is the connotations of that duty or obligation. He's going to have a couple distinctive points in regard to this ethical theory, and you're going to remember these. These are the hypothetical imperative and the categorical imperative. Persons or ends, not means. That's just going to entail, that's going to go with or follow along with the categorical imperative. But the big points grounded in rationality, goodwill, duty, hypothetical, and categorical imperatives. So let's go ahead and start to look at those. Well, before we look at those, just if we want to be consistent with our notes here, obviously the founder or the originator of this version of a deontological ethic is, if it's a Kantian deontological ethic, then surprise, surprise, it's Kant, Immanuel Kant, that originates this, that this begins with. Now, again, as mentioned, there are other versions of deontological ethical theories, such as the divine command theory. That's a type of deontological theory, and we'll look at that later. But again, for this particular lecture, we're going to focus on Kant. Now, these are the objectives. And what I'm debating right now is whether I want to go ahead and look at some of the appeals of this theory before the objectives. So let's try to do that first. Let's go ahead and skip ahead in these in our notes here and see if the appeals, or look at the appeals rather, before we look at the objectives. Now here we go again. Now you see that this is Microsoft Word has crashed once again. We're going to close this out. Please be patient with me here. I apologize. And what we're going to do is we're going to pull up our backup that I had mentioned and try to get into this discussion here. Now, unfortunately, as you're going to see, our slides are not going to be near as pretty as they are, or the font, I should say, is not going to be as pretty as the previous. So let's get this going. How about this? I'll pause it for your sake, that you don't have to watch me do all this. I'll go ahead and pause it and then bring it back up when it's sized correctly. All right, guys. So for you, hopefully that no time at all transpassed, and for me, unfortunately, I use a lot of time trying to fix that. So here we go. Hopefully this will work. Well, I know this will work. This is our trusty backup. So here we go. Let's start with the appeals, like we were saying. Now, again, one of the first appeals would be this, right? Before we go into the depth of it, is that this, as we've already mentioned, is supposed to, Kantian deontology is supposed to give you a real and objective moral absolute, right? It's supposed to actually be able to provide this, right? This is one of the supposed benefits of this theory, is that it can provide what everybody's looking for if they want real and objective moral absolutes, especially in light of this second point here, that many non-religious individuals, right, want to believe, want to hold to, that there are real and objective moral absolutes, right? That this is not something that is monopolized by religious communities, right, or just some specific religion. Meaning you don't have to be, you know, say a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or a Hindu or Buddhist or whatever the case may be, in order to say, well, no, just because I'm not religious, it doesn't mean that I don't hold to real rights and wrongs. This view, deontology, is supposed to be able, this Kantian version of deontology is supposed to be able to give that, provide that as well. Remember, that was one of the appeals of utilitarianism as well, is that it was supposed to be broad in its appeal regardless of religious or worldview, persuasion, per se. Now, the third, and you're going to see this when we go into this, is this system, this Kantian deontology, it pays a very high honor to reason and rationality. It gives this serious, I don't want to say honor again, to use the same word. I don't want to say acquiesce, because it's not begrudgingly does it do this, but it's more than that. It literally is going to ground rights and wrongs, objective rights and wrongs, the ethical theory itself, and the human's ability to reason. Now, again, this is, I would argue, and I would agree, that this is an appeal of the system. That it does this, right? Now, before we go back, let's go forward just to make sure we're not missing one of these here. That we're not missing one of these things. Okay. Yeah, those are the problems. But before we get into the problems, now we're going to backtrack. If you're following along with your own slides, we're going to backtrack to some of the objectives here. So, some of our objectives. Here's your first. It's going to, and I'll just read these all for you. Establish truly absolute and objective moral duties and obligations. Again, right ways to act, wrong ways to act. That is not arbitrary. That these aren't arbitrary, right? And they're not, again, based on the consequences. Kant's not a consequentialist. I know you're thinking of the pun there. Kant is not the consequentialist. 2, it's supposed to reveal the difference between a hypothetical imperative and the categorical imperative. Now, let's go ahead and do that. First, let's go ahead and dismiss with what the hypothetical imperative would be. A hypothetical imperative would be something like, if, notice I'm starting with if, hypothetical, if you want your steak to be much more fulfilling at dinner, at supper time, then you, and notice I said then, so it's an if-then, hence hypothetical. If you want your steak to be more satisfying at supper time, then you will skip your lunch, right? Now, you notice how that's just completely hypothetical, and it's up to your own whim or will, or your own, whatever you want. But notice that there's nothing contradictory, there's nothing immoral about skipping your lunch if you want to enjoy your steak at dinner time, right? Or make it that much more satisfactory in some sense. There's nothing immoral or wrong or contradictory about doing that. So it's just a hypothetical imperative. Now, this is in direct contrast to the categorical imperative. And this categorical imperative, this is huge for Kant here. This is, again, we can't understate the importance of the categorical imperative for Kant, because this is what he's going to try to build his ethical theory around. Now, there's three ways to formulate this particular principle, this categorical imperative. Remember, the axiom that utilitarianism was built upon, remember, was that whichever creates the greatest good for the greatest number of people, that just is the good, right? This categorical imperative is the axiom, basically, that Kant's going to work with. Now, there's three ways to formulate this. Now, the first is, and again, this is just in regards to how in-depth your textbook here is going into that, but I'm going to read this off here. And so here's the first way to formulate the categorical imperative. And remember, he regards this as the supreme moral principle. Here it is. This is the first way to formulate it. There is, therefore, only one categorical imperative. It is, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Let me read that again. There's only, therefore, one categorical imperative. It is, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the exact same time will that it should become a universal law. Now, what does that mean, right? So you're like, wow, that's it? Like, what does that mean? He's saying, what would happen in the logical sense if whatever you're about to do, whatever action you're about to go about, your moral choice, so to speak, what would happen, logically speaking, if everyone tried to put that into play? Now, let's look at the wrong way that that's been often understood. You know, if someone were to say, well, what if you murdered somebody? Or if you murder somebody, well, what if everybody did that? Well, then, you know, this world would be a very unpleasant place, right? Well, that may or may not be true, right? But remember, that's just a consequence. Well, what if everybody murdered somebody? Well, then everybody would be murdered and this place would stink and nobody, we would completely, you know, blah, 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 blah. But remember, Kant, Immanuel Kant, is not, again, our point here, a consequentialist, right? He's not concerned with the consequences. Otherwise, he would just be a utilitarian, right? But he's not a utilitarian, and he's not concerned with the consequences. So remember, Kant's point here is that he is very, 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 he's much more nuanced than that, and he's much more logical than that. Remember, remember we talked about his intellectual genius is, you know, arguably unsurpassed. This guy is trying to ground this in logic and in reason and in rationality. So what Kant is saying, again, is much more nuanced. He's saying that you're creating a contradiction if your desire, if your moral choice here, if your action, if that results in contradiction, then it can't possibly be right because it's self-defeating. So let's take an easy example. Something like lying, right? Kant would say something like this, like the following, say, well, all right, let's say that you break a promise, right? Let's say that you're considering breaking a promise. Well, if you break that promise, well then, if everyone breaks a promise, or if you break a promise, well then, to make a promise is to mean the same thing as to not make a promise. But if it means the same thing as to not make a promise, well then, there's literally no difference between making a promise and not making a promise, which results in contradiction, because to promise is to not promise. All right, pause it, rewind that, listen to it again. If everyone breaks a promise, well then there's literally no difference between those that promise and those that don't promise or break promises. There's no difference, because to make a promise is just to break a promise, right? So it results in contradiction. Now, if you go back to our understanding of the law of non-contradiction, right? Like, for instance, if someone says, well, there's no such thing as truth, well, then is that true? Because if there's no such thing as truth, well, then that must be true, which means there's no such thing as truth. On the other hand, if there's no such thing as truth, then even that's not true, And so I don't even have to listen to it because it's not true either, because there's no such thing as truth. See how that, again, that Kant is self-defeating. It contradicts itself. It's incoherent nonsense. Kant is trying to say that this is the same in regards to morality. Again, so if some moral action results in some sort of contradiction, that it's irrational, well, then it just defeats itself and it's incoherent. Now, you can see why this has such a great appeal in regards to rationality and logic, because it's saying that, wait a minute, morality is intrinsically reasonable in some sense. It's intrinsically logical and rational in some sense. And I think this is okay to say as an appeal, because again, what would it mean to say that your morality is completely irrational? What would it mean to say that I don't even know what that means, right? My morality is completely, absolutely irrational. Well, what on earth does that even mean, right? So I think this is a good appeal when Kant is trying to ground his moral obligations or his morality, his ethical theory, in rationality. But what we're going to see if we're going to eventually go to see if that solves the problem, if that's deep enough in some sense. But it's important to note again that Kant is not just saying, well, if everybody does this, what will be the effect in the sense of some consequence. Again, please remember this point. He's trying to say that if it results in contradiction, logical incoherence here is what Kant is going after. So if you were going to say, back to the murder thing, well, if you say you're about to murder someone, all right, well, could I, to use the words here in the way he words it in the categorical imperative, could I act in accord with this, whatever I'm about to do? Can I will this that everyone would do it without creating some sort of contradiction? So what if everyone went around murdering people, right? Well, the difference in being a murderer and not being a murderer would be nothing, right? There's a contradiction there. There's no difference between murdering people and not murdering people, because people that don't murder people, what? Murder people, right? There's some sense in which a contradiction is created or involved here. Now, you can also see, too, going back to what we had mentioned just previously about this being radically convoluted. Though it does pay a high regard to reason, it's hard to see that anyone actually reasons this way when they're going through their moral choices. But we'll discuss this a little bit later. Now, look at your second point here. When it says display the rationality, the non-arbitrariness of the categorical imperative. All right, what we've done what we tried to do when we just talked about that, when we just discussed that, you see how that's not arbitrary, right? That's not like saying, well, we drive on the left-hand side of the road or the right-hand side of the road, and in England and many of where they had previous colonies and did their imperialistic, regime, whatever. A lot of those places drive on the left hand, but it just as easily could be the opposite. That's just completely arbitrary which side of the road we drive on. Now, you see how Kant's categorical imperative is trying to get around that charge of arbitrariness, right? That it's just willy-nilly, because remember, he's going after logical coherence there. Now, the next way to formulate this is that, well, first let's continue on with this way. Look down at your notes here when it says the test for universalizability. Can all will that this be done by everyone? That is another way to say that particular aspect of the categorical imperative, meaning that can it be universalized, again, without creating, remember, contradiction, logical incoherence of some sort. That's what Kant's going after when he's talking about universalizability. Now try to say that word at 8 a.m. in the morning before your first cup of coffee, universalizability. Now, let's look at some of the ways that this categorical imperative is cashed out. Because what he's trying to do is, in a way, when we look at the law of non-contradiction, there's different angles by which you can look at that particular law, right? Because the law of identity, the first three principles of logic are the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, and the law of excluded middle. And really, those are not exactly the same, but they're coming at the same principle in a certain sense from different angles, right? Well, Kant's trying to do something like that when he talks about there's these three formulations of this one categorical imperative. So the next is that here's the second formulation of that is act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another. He's meaning just anybody. Act so that whoever you're talking about, whether it be somebody else or yourself, they're always being treated as an end and never as a means, right? So basically saying that you always treat people as an end in and of themselves. You never treat people as just a means to an end, right? Now, I think that that's a positive, right? I mean, because this is why we would argue something like prostitution and things of that nature are wrong, because you're just treating people simply as some means to an end for your own, kicks or gratification or whatever. You're just using them, right? This is another way to say it. You're just using human beings, right? And Kant is saying that you can't possibly do this. You can't make this universalizable, right? You can't universalize that, because what Kant would say is something like, notice that you can't do that in regard to yourself. You can't just use yourself as some means to an end without at the same time treating yourself as an ends to a mean. And since that can't be done without creating some sort of contradiction, some sort of logical incoherence, then this is another way to look at the categorical imperative, that you always treat people as a means, you always treat people as an ends rather than just some means to an end. Now, a lot of philosophers have really applauded Kant for this, because they would say something like that this is very original in regards to ethical thinking up to that point. Now, maybe that had been forgotten to some extent, but we're going to have to actually go back in history a little and say this really, even though it's good that Kant recognized this and says this, it's really not even original to Kant. We have the early, medieval philosopher, Augustine, more popularly known as St. Augustine. Remember, St. Augustine is the place in Florida. Augustine is the medieval philosopher. Supposed to be the same person, but anyway. Augustine was noted as saying that we should what? Does anybody remember this? Augustine was noted as saying that we should love people and use things, not love things and use people. All right, so let's repeat that. Augustine said that we should love people and use things. We should not love things and use people. Now, do you see how this really, he states this, hundreds of years, centuries prior to Kant. But do you see how this is really saying what? That people are an ends in and of themselves and not just merely some means to an end, right? You don't just use people, right? So in that sense, great that Kant points this out, that, that we should use people or treat people as an end in and of themselves. But really, this principle has also already been established long before. Just a side note. Now, that's the second formulation of that categorical imperative. The third is this about the idea of the will of every rational being as making universal law. And so, again, what on earth does this mean? Basically, it's saying something like that we are the legislators of this, right? That the moral law doesn't come from some outside source. It comes from our own rational nature. We can't get around this, Kant would say. That we are the legislators of the moral law. Now, let's talk about this this issue here of the goodwill very quickly. Your third point from the bottom. It says, reveal that goodwill is one of the acts for the sake of, reveal that goodwill is one that acts for the sake of duty. So what is the goodwill? Essentially, Kant would argue that the goodwill, somebody's will, right, your desire to do this or the other, is the only thing that can really be good in and of itself. Because he would argue that even if you, let's say a modern example would be something like mob bosses. Even mob bosses or whoever can tell the truth. And if telling the truth is a good thing, then, well, then how can it be good if mob bosses do it, right? He would argue something like that. So he'd say, really, the only thing that can be good in and of itself is a person's motivations, right? Their will there, the goodwill. Now, I think that there's an ounce of truth to this, and I think it can be seen in, say, something like the following example. Let's say that we have a guy that wants to do the right thing, right? And let's say that his wife has asked him and pleaded with him to go cut the grass, right? Well, let's say that he absolutely hates cutting the grass. He despises cutting the grass. All he wants to do is finish watching the game. He, does not want to use his Saturday cutting the grass, right? But even though he hates it, even though he wants to watch the game, he wants to do the right thing. So he gets up out of his sense of duty, right? Deontology, duty, obligation. He gets up and he goes and cuts the grass, right? Now, in contrast, let's say, and there's another man 2. Let's say the situation is almost identical, except for this guy, man 2, he loves cutting the grass and he wants to be outside, loves that. He couldn't care less about who's playing football, right? Let's say his wife has been asking him to cut the grass, and so he gets up, says, okay, honey, no problem, I'll go cut the grass. Now, they've both done the exact same action, right? But Kant might say something like, well, right, but the first guy really did the morally upright thing. Why? Well, because he did it out of a sense of duty. He did it even though he didn't like doing it. He went and did it because it was the right thing to do. In contrast to the second guy, well, he already likes cutting the grass. Who doesn't do what they don't like doing? How is that? Why should he be credited as doing something right or moral or upstanding when he just likes doing it anyway? The first guy who hates doing it, who doesn't want to do it, but did it because it was the right thing to do, and that was his whole reason of doing it was because he wanted to do the right thing, not because he liked doing it. Well, that's the one that really did the better, or really the moral, the morally correct, morally good act there. It's that guy. It's guy 1. Now, it can be a little more nuanced than that, depending on our arguments that we can get into. But there does seem to be some grain of truth to that. Of course, the downside of that, just right off the bat, would be the ancients might say, the old school philosophers, classical philosophers would say something like, oh, wait a minute, that seems to be a little dreary, right? Is really the only time you do the right thing is when you hate it? Well, that seems to be a dark way to look at the world. In fact, they would say something like, and we'll look at this theory later, something like virtue theory is, well, why can't you become, let's use something like this, to use a little more fanciful language, why can't you turn into just the kind of being, the kind of person that wants to not only do the right thing, but you enjoy doing the right thing? That seems to be a much more happy result, right? That not only do you can become the kind of person that wants to do the right thing, but that you enjoy, you turn into a thing that enjoys. Not that just does the right thing, but that enjoys, finds purpose and pleasure in doing the good, right? But we'll save that for later. But that was Kant's point. And I think there is some truth to that, right? That there is something to be said for somebody that does something out of a motive that's not completely just because they like doing it or whatever. But even if they don't want to, they do it anyway. I think there's something to be said for that. Now, let's, and again, so you see your last point of note here, depending on which textbook we're using here, if you want further, there's that note, the last point there that has a couple different ways to look at that if you want to look at that. Now, let's continue on with our objectives. As already mentioned, the principles are derived, these moral principles are derived from our own rational nature. So let's read through these first before we try to unpack some of this. Again, just the very fact that we're rational, the very fact that human nature has some sort of rationality to it, Kant would say this gives us our intrinsic worth. Remember about treating people as an end in and of themselves and not just as a means to an end. Now, this is supposed to be, again, what gives us our intrinsic worth and dignity. And so, therefore, the result of this is that we legislate, we are the legislators of right and wrong. And where does that right and wrong come from? Rationality, right? Logic. once Kant would argue that once you see this, once you see that the rational nature behind this, you would see that it can't be any other way, right? There is no other way for morality to be. And again, this is where we talked about Augustine arguing something like the imago Dei, right? What he would call, which is Latin for the image of God, right? That people are created in the image of God, that they already have this intrinsic value, this intrinsic worth already built in by virtue of the fact that they're made in the very image of God himself, regardless of race, class, any of these sorts of things. Now again, we've already discussed these appeals, but very quickly, these may make more sense now that we've went through the objectives of what Kant was trying to do with this project. Now, again, you see one of the appeals is supposed to give us this real or objective, absolute moral sense, or not moral sense, but moral truths, so to speak. Again, the appeal to many non-religious folks or individuals that desire a real or objective moral absolute, moral rights and wrongs. Now, again, we just can't underestimate, we can't downplay the significance that Kant's theory gives to reason and rationality, and the role that it plays there. Now, let's go ahead and look at some of the problems of this. I'm not sure if I'm going to say this later in my slides. I can't remember. If we do, we'll just point it out again. But I just want to go ahead, before we even look at this first problem, and just realize, again, you're probably already thinking, man, this is like drinking from a fire hydrant. We've dumped, there's been so much dumped out in the almost 40 minutes that have passed that I'm almost lost as to what is even going on with this guy. Well, I would say that is, and again, I may address this in a second on the slide, but just to go ahead and point out, just that maybe one of the first difficulties with this is that you see how convoluted and technical and difficult this particular ethical theory is, if we're trying to say that people not only come to how they come to their moral decisions, their ethical decisions, but if it's supposed to show us how this is grounded as well, which leads right into this. Let's read it. Kant seems to believe that all would come to the same conclusions using reason. Remember, everything was about being rational, right? Logical. If you just think about it, it would go through the process, and everyone would come to see the absolute right or the absolute wrong. Now this just seems to be demonstrably false, right? This seems to be just, if we just observe all of the competing yet reasonable ethical systems, right? We haven't gone through all of them, but we have already gone through at least one, right? Utilitarianism, depending on the order that you're following with our lectures and our reading here, is that there have been many brilliant minds that have come up with ethical theories that are in stark contrast to one another. So for instance, Kant's ethical theory is in stark contrast to utilitarianism, right? It even contradicts it, yet they're supposed to be reasonable in some sense. Utilitarianism doesn't claim to be unreasonable or completely illogical, right? But even more so, something like Aristotle's, natural law theory and virtue theory is in contrast with Kant's deontological ethic. You have divine command theories, which are also deontological type ethics that are in contrast in a lot of ways with Kant's theory. You have something like situation ethics, which again is in direct contrast to Kant's deontological system. And they're all supposed to be somewhat reasonable, right? They're supposed to be rational. Meaning, in other words, all of these have been thought through. None of these are supposed to be just willy-nilly or completely arbitrary, right? We've had brilliant minds that have tried to work through these particular ethical theories. Now, important note, that doesn't mean that Kant's wrong, right? Just because these all disagree. But it does serve as a serious red flag to say that rationality or reason alone is completely sufficient to get us to these moral truths if we're using them just by themselves, because there's competing systems that are arguably very rational, right? Very, very logical, especially when something like the metaphysics of, say, Aristotle's natural law theory. Now, let's continue to push through some of these. Remember Kant, not only was he giving his system producing objective rights and wrongs, real rights, real wrong actions, but he was even going towards the view that there are absolute rights and wrongs. Now, whether or not you agree with as to if there are absolute rights and wrongs, we'll discuss this much later in the course. But his system does nothing with what we would call moral dilemmas, right? Well, what are moral dilemmas? Moral dilemmas are when supposedly two absolute rules of morality, if we want to put it that way, come up against one another, right? When they come against one another. Well, what do you do with those, right? So the classic example of this, one of the classic examples of this is old school, you got the Nazis knocking at the door, right? You've got the Nazis knocking at the door, you're hiding Jews in the basement, and the Nazis ask you, are you hiding Jews in this home? Are there any Jews in here? Well, of course, you know that if you, quote, tell the truth and say, well, yeah, they're down in the basement, you know they're just going to be rounded up and systematically murdered. They're going to be killed simply because they're Jewish, right? Well, that seems wrong, right? It seems, the natural inclination is, well, no, I want to save these people's lives. I'm not going to tell these guys the truth that they're down here. So you've got this moral dilemma. Do you tell the truth or do you save the lives of these people, right? These innocent people. Well, Kant's system, and we'll see how some other deontological type systems will try to work this out later. But Kant's system doesn't have any solution to this. His system's you tell the truth. Again, you don't worry about the consequences. Bad as they may be, you tell the truth. It is your duty to tell the truth, even if these consequences happen. Now remember, utilitarianism wanted to take into effect the consequences completely, thoroughly, to determine the right or wrong action. Well, Kant's system is not taking that into effect at all, and so you're having to tell the truth at the expense of all of these innocent lives in the basement, and whatnot. They're going to be murdered if you tell the truth. Or let's think about another potential dilemma, not necessarily as drastic, but nevertheless a dilemma. Let's say that you promise to meet your wife for dinner, right? And your children for dinner. Let's say that you've been working a lot lately. You've missed important, appointments with your family. You missed a couple birthdays, maybe an anniversary, and you're like, look, I don't care what happens next. I promise you, I'm not going to miss our Sunday evening dinner together once again. It's not going to happen. I'm going to meet you. And let's say that when you leave the office this time, you've made this promise, right, to your family, and on the way to the office, or on the way home from the office, you see a child on a tricycle tumble down a little hill into a pond, right? Let's say he's maybe a year or two old. And you know that he can't swim, right? And let's say that you've also made a previous promise, maybe you were a Boy Scout, I don't know, in some point in your life, you made a previous promise to always, rescue children, right? Or do good when you have the opportunity to. Well, obviously, you see this little boy tumble his little tricycle down into this pond, and you're driving. Well, do you break the promise to your wife to be on time for this appointment, possibly even miss the appointment, right? Miss this dinner with your wife and your family, in order to save this child, to honor a previous promise to protect innocence or to save children or whatever it is that you've done, right? Again, you see those are two moral absolutes that have come up against one another. Which one do you do, right? It doesn't seem to have any room on how to work through or to negotiate these sorts of problems. Well, of course, some people might argue that, well, this is just a problem because you're letting your intuition override rationality here, and what you need to do is just perform your duty. Well, okay, but what again? What if you just made two promises, right, and they come into conflict with one another? Uh, Much less just two different seeming, things that you ought to do, right? Now, again, we're going to look at a different deontological theory later that's how that tries to navigate through some of these, what we would call moral dilemmas. I don't think that one of the things that we can do, I don't think a viable option is to deny that moral dilemmas didn't exist. So the third problem here is that type of system just seems to deny that they do exist, that there are real moral dilemmas that present themselves within the course of a person's life. I think just the two examples we've shown, one being a real life example that we do know, the World War II examples of Nazis at the door and whatnot. But then I guarantee there's probably even a student watching this that can think of a moral dilemma that's similar to, maybe even almost identical to, even the second just random thought experiment that we constructed about, promising one thing to someone and then this happening over here. I think they actually exist, and I don't think that it's very convincing to try to argue that they're just not really there. Now, going back to the categorical imperative, remember, when you were thinking through some particular action to see if it would be the right thing or the wrong thing, the way that it was worded would create a contradiction, right? Now, what if you could word something? What if you could word a potential problem, word, a potential immoral action, and the way that you word it made it not contradictory? So what if you were to say something, just off the top of my head, well, I should always do the greatest good for the greatest number of people, which is just utilitarianism, right? If possible. Now, that particular wording may not create some sort of contradiction, or it may. But the point would be, and this is just a standard objection that many philosophers have tossed out, is that there are examples of one particular action being worded one way that does seem to create some sort of contradiction. But then, on the other hand, if it's worded a different way, it doesn't create the contradiction. So a lot of this even seems to come down to, well, things create contradictions. Things can't be universalizable simply based on how they're worded or not worded. And that would be a major problem, right, if that objection holds through or continues. Now, another that I want to point out that I think is very important to note here, and we'll spend a little more time on this one, is this. It seems to equate morality with intellectual ability, right, or disability. A mistake within a math problem versus, say, neglecting to save a child. So, for instance, remember, in Kant's view, if you've done something that creates contradiction, right, and again, we'll just go for the sake of argument that it's worded, precisely and all these sorts of things, and that if you do something and it creates contradiction, then it's absolutely wrong, or it's immoral. But again, it seems like there are times in our lives when we make intellectual mistakes, but we're not being immoral, right? It seems like there are times in our lives where we may not be as rational as we could possibly be. Nevertheless, we're not being immoral in the process. So it doesn't seem like that there's this identity of rationality and morality. Now, maybe Kant or someone would say, well, I'm not claiming that. Well, if we're not claiming that, or if that's not the claim, and yet it's rationality, it's logic in the sense that there's no contradiction that grounds this morality, well then, why is it not to be equated with intellectual mistakes as opposed to correct thinking, right? So for instance, imagine if you are riding down the street and you see a woman with a flat tire, right, and you don't stop for whatever reason, and let's say you go through the whole process and that somehow creates a contradiction and that's why you should have stopped. Well, let's say that when you get home, your child misses a math problem, right? Somehow they've gone through the formula, the algebraic formula, and they've made a misstep in the thing, and so the end result is wrong, and they've made an intellectual mistake, right? Well, do you spank the child, right, or put the child in timeout or whatever it is that you discipline the child? Do you discipline the child? Do you hold them morally accountable for missing the math problem? All things being equal, let's say that it's not somewhere they should know better because they weren't paying attention to whatever. They just made a mistake in their intellectual reason, in the reasoning process. Do you hold them morally accountable for that? Well, no. I mean, you wouldn't spank your child simply because they made a mistake in their math. You know, all things being equal, they made a mistake. It was an intellectual mistake. Well, let's say that when you're riding down the road and you see the person on the side of the road or whatever with a flat tire and you don't stop to help them, it seems also in that sense that if you were wrong, then you just as easily could have you may have just made an intellectual mistake, and yet you've done something immoral by ignoring the person that needed help. Well, if that's true, then it seems like, well, then morality must be something more than just this intellectual, math problem, as it were. It seems like there must be something more to morality than just rationality. Does that make sense? It seems like there must be something more about right and wrong than just logic or rationality. And I would argue that there is, right? I would argue that that morality is not going to be that. Morality is not going to be unreasonable, but it's going to be more than just reasonable. Morality is not going to be illogical, but it's going to also be something beyond merely logic. Again, I think that an ethical theory is going to be logical and rational and make sense in some way, right? But it's not going to be only right or wrong simply because it makes sense, or simply because it's not contradictory, or it's correct reasoning intellectually. Now, the sixth goes right into that, and that assumes that one has a moral obligation to the principle of being rational to begin with. Right now, we're looking at, again, another metaphysical question, because remember, all of these things are supposed to ground morality. This is supposed to make something truly right, truly wrong, give you real rights, give you real wrongs. But doesn't Kant's Deontology assume that I have some sort of moral obligation to be rational? What if I don't care about being rational? Think about that for a moment. What if you don't care if you're irrational or rational? Well, you say, well, you're still objectively wrong morally or immorally. Well, but again, why doesn't that just assume that I have an obligation, a standing obligation, to not create contradictions? Okay, maybe I can't not do it, but that seems to be less than what is required for me to be morally obligated to it, right? So again, is there some principle of rationality with a capital P that I'm morally obligated to obey? And if so, how do you explain that, right? Not just to be in order to be intellectually correct, but to be morally correct. Why do I have a moral obligation to be intellectually correct if it's just grounded within our own ability to reason, right? Again, just to put it simply and succinctly, this whole system assumes that one has a moral obligation to the principle of being rational to begin with. Well, why should I be rational? Suppose irrationality is what I want to do, right? Right? Then where's my moral obligation come from? Now, again, this is something that we've looked at with each ethical theory so far. And that is just simply, how do we account for moral guilt? Do you lay in the bed at night, if you're wrestling with guilt that something has gone wrong, that you've done something wrong, and do you think that the reason that you feel such heavy guilt is simply because you've been irrational throughout the day at some point, that you made a mistake in your intellectual process at the day? Is that really, when you think deeply about it, does that really account for this overwhelming sense that you've done something wrong? Well, really, it's because I was irrational. Is that really it? Or does it really make more sense to say that there was some person or some ultimate obligation that I feel guilty because I really am guilty? And I really have done something, quote unquote, morally wrong that's not just a mistake in my intellectual, process. That it's not just some mistake in my intellectual reasoning and whatnot. It seems like that has to be something that we at least take into account. Now, let's look at a couple takeaways from this. As we've already admitted, and we can readily concede, there do seem to be actions that are purely wrong in and of themselves, intrinsically wrong, right? So again, this was one of the terrible aspects of utilitarianism, is that there was no single action that was just wrong in and of itself, right? If the numbers worked, if the data worked, if the numbers crunched, if they came out right, then even raping the person on the island or whatever, if that somehow resulted in the greatest good for the most people, even though that one person it was absolutely hellish, well, then that was somehow, quote unquote, the right thing to do. Again, it just seems to, and I would say that serves itself as a very strong premise, that it doesn't matter if everyone else is happy or not, or how much pleasure it produces for everyone else, that there's something intrinsically wrong about doing that, right? Some of these particular actions, go back to the utilitarianism lecture that we looked at, that there are some particular actions that are just wrong, and it really doesn't matter what the consequence is. Those are just wrong in and of themselves. Our next takeaway would be this, but on the other hand, there is something there seems to be something needed ontologically, metaphysically. Again, these are these metaphysical, meta-ethical considerations. There needs to be something more than just rationality, right? That would ground true rights and true wrongs. Also, there seems to be there's just got to be something that can account for these moral dilemmas that we looked at. Do you not tell the truth to the Nazis in order to save the innocent lives, or do you save the innocent lives, or do you tell the truth even though it's going to cost these innocent lives? There's got to be some way to work around these moral dilemmas. Now, if you find this convincing as an ethical theory, that's going to have to be something that you take into account, right? But I don't think that you can do is simply hand wave some of the objections or some of the difficulties with Kant's version of Deontology. I think those have to be taken into serious consideration before one would adopt something like this as his or her ethical theory. Again, in my view, I just think there's too many problems to hold this as a completely sufficient ethical theory, especially meta-ethically, the grounding of this. Not that there's not valuable insights in this theory, but at the same time that there has to be something more, something a little more robust about our intellectual experience, or let me say, I should say rather our moral experience. There has to be something more robust about our moral experience that's not simply reduced to our intellectual capacity. Now, last thought. When you think of a farmer, sitting out on his tractor or whatever, and he's going through what he needs to do. Let's say he's wrestling through some moral conundrum. Could you really imagine my grandfather, for instance, a very simple man, sharecropper, picked cotton, for a large portion of his life. From all accounts, it seems to me that he was a very moral individual. But I can go ahead and tell you right now that there was no way on earth that he could go through some sort of process like this in order to come up with his ability to make moral choices. Now, notice I'm not trying to mix or confuse moral epistemology with moral ontology. Maybe This Kant system grounds what he's doing as either really right or really wrong. But at least epistemologically, there's no way that a person like he and others like him, maybe you know of some, maybe your own parents or grandparents or whoever, maybe you, you're not going through this unbelievably convoluted system simply in order to make a moral decision. Now, again, that doesn't mean it's right or wrong in and of itself, but it does seem to be something that we have to take into account. Is this really best explained? Does this particular theory best explain human experience? And one, how do they come to know right and wrong? But then also the grounding of right and wrong actions, truly right and truly wrong actions. So some things to think about as we continue on with our ethical discussions here. And this would be something that I want you to read through in regard to Kant's theory. This is basically just like I did with utilitarianism. This is just a big summary of that. In fact, I'll just read it for you very quickly. Duty, deontological, the goodwill. So Kant, on the other hand, right, in comparison to utilitarianism, has a very sophisticated moral philosophy. Kant believes in the existence of objective right and wrong. However, he grounds these, or tries to, these objective rights and wrongs, these realities, in pure reason, or what is rational. Kant introduces what he calls the hypothetical imperatives and the categorical imperatives. Naturally, the hypothetical imperative are if-then guides to behavior that are not necessarily objective, right? The categorical imperative is Kant's attempt at true objective morality. The first is that one should act in accord in such a way that his actions could be carried out by all as if it were a universal law, without, again, a contradiction. This is an important point, and that most mistake Kant's first imperative as if it were solely concerned with the consequences of their behavior. If you lie, and if all people lie, then earth would be rather unpleasant. Kant is more logical than this. His concern is more to the point that if you break a promise, and all people break a promise, then the concept of a promise is a contradiction and meaningless. The second imperative is that one should never treat individuals as simply a means to an end, but as an end. Again, much like Augustine. The third is that of personal autonomy. We are the legislators of morality, as we are to reason each action as to conclude if it should be universal. Kant's system is deontological. That is, it is concerned with the facing rule, whatever's right before you, and the consequence does not matter. One is to base his actions solely by duty. Remember we talked about that. Why are you doing what you're doing? Because it's the right thing or just because you like it or whatnot. And it's grounded in reason, not by fear of punishment or anticipation of reward. The goodwill is paramount for Kant. Obviously, one may perform the right action so that his wife will not leave, right? Or his friends will speak well of him, say he's trying to run for mayor or whatever. Or he keeps his business as opposed to losing business. But Kant states that these reasons are simply egotistical and have nothing to do with performing one's duty with a correct intention or a motive, right? Just again, that's basically those two paragraphs there are Kant's Deontology in a nutshell. Here's some more stuff if you want to look that up, if this interests you. Until next time.